Buenos dias. Welcome to our session with Jose Gonzalez. I am Francisco Paco Yervides, and I've been assisting with the planning of this marvelous and very productive conference. I have attended several sessions, especially this morning session on anti-racism. It was very good. I want to congratulate Serenella, Eliza, Denise, and everyone that has worked for months on the execution of this awesome virtual event. I am the Executive Director to Green Leadership Trust, and we are a national organization that places and trains leaders of color and indigenous people to serve on boards to environmental organizations. One of the speakers of this morning, for example, Jackie Patterson, is part of GLT. One of your awardees from yesterday, Abelo Belio. So if you're interested in serving on a board, to have influence on decision making at that level, or if you're currently serving on a board, I will place my website and my email in the chat box. But I have the pleasure to introduce now our colleague, Jose Gonzalez. I first met Jose about 5 years ago when I was looking for an engaged Latino speaker from my previous job as Leadership Development Manager for River Network. This is a national conservation group, and Jose agreed to speak at our conference. He's a partner at the Abarna Group, but as you will hear for yourselves, he's also very experienced and very passionate. I view him as a kind and committed trailblazer, to be frank. He's an artist, he's a nature lover, he's a science communicator and an educator, and he founded Latino Outdoors. He's now the former executive director of this group, and several of us thought that he would be an ideal keynote for this type of event. Like many of us, he has worn many hats as a K-12 public education teacher, an environmental education advisor, an outdoor education instructor, a coordinator, and even an university adjunct faculty. There he has many hats and shirt in his shirt. His commentary on diversity has been featured on High County News, Earth Island Journal, Latino USA. He's been the main contributor to the environmental desk at Latino News Daily. He's featured in Outside Magazine, The Hill, the Sacramento Bee, NBC News. Not only that, he's also been engaged in collaborations at the White House Council of the Environmental Quality, the U.S. Department of the Interior, and the National Park Service. He has participated in coalitions like the Latino Conservation Alliance, the Next 100 Coalition. So his work is amazing. He searches to make a network of inclusivity groups connecting people of all races, genders, orientations, socioeconomic statuses, and religions. He, through the Primavera initiative, he supported local community-based groups and has grown a nationwide movement of nature lovers. He holds a master's degree of natural resources from the University of Michigan and a bachelor degree from University of California, Davis. And as if that was enough, he has been recipient of the National Wildlife National Conservation Education Award, the Kenji Award, the Muri Center Rising Leader Award, and has been recognized by the Grist magazine. So gracias, Jose, for agreeing to speak to us this morning. It is an honor and a pleasure, and please take it away.
Muchas gracias, Francisco. It is a pleasure igualmente. Hope everyone can hear me well. With apologies ahead of time, if I miss, I'm going to try to leave some time at the end to handle some questions. But if I miss things in the chat, I just won't be able to keep track of them as well. Y también apologies to the interpreters, translators, porque every now and then todavía my English is not very good looking, as well as mi español un poco pocho y rascuache that would not be approved by the Academia Real. But here we are. So I'm excited to be here with you. I have a couple of things that I'll share with you. Like I said, I'll move relatively quickly and see how we can chat a little bit more at the end. And that we're just going to run out of time as well. I think that's just the case of how it's going to go. Okay. So make sure I got this ready. So as a reminder, aquí estamos. Oops, excuse me. As a reminder, here we are, excited to be with you all at the Natural Latinos Conference, the third one. I still remember the first one, and the work that's been going past it. I will, of course, invite everybody to jump on. If you are in social media, make use of it. Tweet, use the hashtags accordingly. Follow, drop handles in the chat. That's always fun. Housekeeping, I think you're familiar with this as well. In case you need help, ask away. As I'm presenting, again, I won't likely be able to keep track of everything that you might say, but just want to make sure that that's happening there. All right. So, I'll talk about kind of the outdoors experience, but for me, obviously, it's interconnected with so much of what's woven around our cultural identity, and it's part of the reason of the founding of Latino Outdoors, and part of those phrases like "estamos aquí" and "yo cuento" as a way to kind of acknowledge presence in the way that often isn't acknowledged, as well as how something like "yo cuento" has that el doble sentido in a positive way, to say yo cuento as an I count as well as I tell a story, and how we count through the stories that we tell and the stories that we expand and affirm. And as an acknowledgement of that, as an example of how you address specific erasure, I'll also add in that I'm joining you all from the West Coast, actually. So I am on ancestral, traditional, stolen, and unceded land of the Maidu, Nisian Southern Maidu, in Miwok, in what is now Sacraslan, California, Sacramento. And I share this because, land, it's important. A land acknowledgement is an example, as you were commenting on my shirt, about how it's a starting point of engagement. And it's important in terms of indigenous communities because of the specific and direct erasure in terms of government policy, for example, genocide, and so forth. And that matters then as part of the spectrum of reparation. So to me, that's critical and important. And even when you use words, is that they have different intent. So traditional and ancestral is related and different than stolen and unceded, because then you begin to unpack what it means in terms of what is considered a homeland in relation to where a tribe now is, which may have federal recognitions, which has treaty rights, which ones don't have treaty rights, and so forth. So for me, it begins to unpack that. And of course, that's woven within a natural environment. And, in terms of this unpacking of identity, I'm an immigrant from Mexico. So sometimes you may have heard me say that I'm Mexicano by birth. I am a U.S. citizen through naturalization. I'm a Latino through social, cultural identity. I'm Latinx through solidarity, Chicano through social political identity, and Hispanic by census count. So I do say that with some humor. And for me, that's important to understand the purpose and reasons and relationship of those terms, so that they matter in how I use them and how I don't use them. And I don't expend my energy in the essentially in the overexpenditure of conflict to prove who I am, if I understand, if I'm willing to put the energy into deeper engagement and understanding, and to know why a term exists on the census that I might not immediately relate to, and yet it's part of the struggle of my community for recognition in terms of how the census exists as a tool for the allocation of resources, right? Like those are the components that are more exciting to me specifically. And so, and unpacking this identity for me, it comes with several facets which include the recognition, responsibility, and reconnection. So the recognition is just knowing that we are a multifaceted community. There are so many faces to what composes the Latinx identity, and that it has evolved, it is evolving, and it will evolve. And so the question is, what keeps us grounded? What keeps us rooted in what that means, in ways that holds as much space for our community, rather than dedicating too much time into things like, well, are you considered to be part of the community if you speak Spanish or not? And I'm like, well, again, where do we want to invest the energy? The responsibility comes that we are, products, we are, our mestizaje is one of colonized and colonizer, which is part, for me, the excitement of being able to say this, how we engage with the current tension, conflict, and recognition of dealing with that, we live through it. So this idea of occupying multiple spaces is grounded in part of our heritage in that way. in that way, and that it comes with a responsibility to recognize how we can be how we can practice allyship and ownership and anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity and anti uh, even in homophobia, for example. All of that to me matters, and that part of through that work comes a reconnection to a lot of the blessings that we already have in this work, that a lot of, especially around conservation, environmental and nature-based behaviors, actions, and ethics, our indigeneity has a lot of that in which we can reconnect. And that the youth, for me, I see them wanting to better connect with that and understand that. And that's part of the blessings that our ancestors, our elders, and our abuelitas, for example, carry, that I think it can serve with some of that multi-generational and intergenerational um, power. So I'll go quickly through a few of these other things. Part of what's exciting also that for me comes with, as the late and esteemed for me, Antonio Gonzalez, who would often tell me, he's like, look, it is about environmental justice, and it's also beyond that, because it comes with just a recognition of power. And that's for me, when I do the work around, diversity, equity, and inclusion, some of the spaces, is to acknowledge the demographic inevitability, right? The demographic inevitability comes with that the demographics of 2050 and 2060 are very different than 1950 and 1960. And for us, regardless what the demographic categorization is used in a study, whether Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, one is to understand what that means, but the other is just to also know what that means in terms of numbers. And in whatever way you look at census data and other demographic information, is to acknowledge that our community at large is going to increase, even as a quote unquote non-Hispanic white is going to continue to decrease. And to me, that presents both the challenge, but also the opportunity of what this means in responsibility. So that the conservation successes, the conservation, the nature work, our stewardship in terms of our natural and public land spaces is in our hands in many ways. And so it's how do we prepare to be with each other through that, rather than automatically default to a source of zero-sum loss. And nothing new here, I think, for this community is to acknowledge that in a lot of the recent data and information across environmental, conservation, nature-based outdoor work, climate change, renewable energy, shows that Latinos are part of this, like many other non-white communities, that statistically continue to show up as caring more, as being willing to take action, as wanting to be kind of part of the solution, and not necessarily that you need to be convinced around climate change denial, as an example. And then that comes at the same time as we have experienced and faced historic and systemic discrimination and exclusion. This just came out this year through Hispanic Access Foundation and Center for American Progress. It captures some of the things that we've known in many ways, to be able to say, this is the experience, this is what it has meant to experience this. And that connects to this work of equity, diversity, and inclusion, because we've continued, the demographic shift has an impact not just on how many quote unquote people of color there are, is what does it mean in terms of having now these communities, these individuals be represented in spaces of decision making and places of power. So, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement could, through that work, you could now physically take off the signs that say, white and colored, as an example. And it's important to recognize that as Latinos, you fell in that spectrum, and you could benefit from white passing or white privilege, and you could also be extremely discriminated based on the color of your skin. So that's part of that facet. However, that didn't mean taking the signs down didn't automatically mean that the spaces of decision making and power, elected officials, head of corporations, head of foundations, you name it, those didn't automatically open up. And so why we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice-oriented work is to recognize what are those systemic elements, that those walls that need to come down, or as they come down, or as those spaces are open, as power sharing happens. What does that mean, and how do we prepare for that? And so that's part of that shift of moving just from the cool, we can tolerate you, to we acknowledge you as different, here's a Hispanic Heritage Month, to there's actually value in that, to now what does it mean to have you be in spaces of the decision-making power. And we see that across the US. In California, for example, acknowledging how much of our legislature we have elected leaders that represent some of those components. And this is important because for me, it begins to connect to a lot of the movement-based language, right? That sometimes either people are a bit more prepared or less more prepared to kind of engage with and understand. But for me, it's when I encounter this, is to be able to understand, here's what my role can be, and here's part of how I can be part of the ecosystem of flipping this, so that we can talk about supremacy, capitalism, colonization, and how we invest our energy in fighting against this, as well as thinking about understanding to say, well, how does this influence something like how we engage with nature, and be able to think about how nature in itself can provide a lot of the language and the framing to flip that, so that we invest the energy into, we're also investing energy into what we're building as much into what we are tearing down. And no surprise, this is off the work of Michelle Holliday, off of her work of Dr. Rupa Maria, a doctor in the San Francisco Bay Area, to be able to say, hey, all of these elements that we sometimes talk about, like stewardship, nature's abundance, thrivability, regenerative development, come from a flip of this relationship that we can get with and through the natural world. And so I'm going to quickly move into a couple of what I mean about the story mattering, right? Because there's the information and there's the data, but as an expression kind of says, data makes you credible, stories make you memorable. They can go hand in hand to be able to say this is how and why it matters. In California, we just the Latinx population just reached plurality recently. That means it's the largest single ethnic demographic group. And so back in 2012, 2013, this is part of the story, which is to say, oh, by this date, some polls suggest Hispanics will become the biggest ethnic group in California. And here's the phrase: surpassing whites for the very first time, right? For the first time. And why that matters is because, it's an example of that type of erasure, but also of how it can perpetuate this idea that as the Latinx community, as Hispanos, as Chicanos, we're always new, right? We fit that new immigrant experience. And while that may be true, and it's important to acknowledge how we need to support those aspects of our community, it also ignores the whole fact of how we have been here. And so something as commemorized through the ANZA National Historic Trail, the superintendent there, Latina Naomi Torres, when I first, chatted with her years ago, for her to say, Jose, here's the story of Black and brown people from Mexico migrating up north for better economic opportunities. And I'm like, that's as real a story then as it is now. Like, right, that's my story in terms of migrating from Mexico to California. And it's not to make it pretty, it's not to romanticize it. That's important not to do that, because it's still a process of colonization. And so for me is, how do I embrace all of that? Because that to me is part of what I need to be able to hold on to as I move forward, rather than automatically rejecting it, misunderstanding it, or simplifying and romanticizing in a way that isn't helpful and constructive for the work that we need to do to prepare for that 2050 and beyond. Okay. Quick examples of what this has meant about this idea of then unearthing our nature cultura, so to speak, our conservation cultura, is to acknowledge how we've been part of this work and movement in many different ways. Some of these I think you may be familiar with. I share these as examples of kind of how I grew through this, and what it meant for me to hold this. So George Melendez Wright, for example, of Salvadorian descent, was a key figure in the National Park Service, especially in getting them to really understand the ecological value of national parks, which is kind of a given today. We have to remember back then a lot of this had to be built. Here he is in Yosemite, as an example, back in the 1920s. I think the word is highly appropriate here. A Chingona Inés Mejia, Sierra Club member in 1920, of Mexicana descent, here in the U.S. Also, member of Save the Redwoods League, of which I'm a counselor out in California, botanist, and she did this all in her quote unquote later years. So to me, knowing that these stories were out there and I didn't know about them as I was going through my own schooling. The Bracero program, of course, is familiar, but the connection there is also acknowledging that DDT, which is this iconic battle and point of inflection in the American environmental movement, and we can attach Rachel Carson, we can attach Silent Spring, we can even connect the birth of Environmental Defense Fund, for example. But lost in that story is the lawsuit by Rafaela Abascal from California Rural Legal Assistance in California on behalf of 6 migrant farm workers, mothers, that became the lawsuit, that became the base for EDF to be successful in terms of showing human impact, in addition to and separate from the impact on birds, as for example. So to me, that's part of saying, like, those are part of the heroes of the story. Of course, the Mercedes, the land grant, I don't call it a struggle or fight, but I think that's a perfect example of acknowledging that just as so many of our public lands, all of our public lands really, are stolen native land, indigenous land, and an added layer to that is how much they're also later on stolen lands from a lot of the Hispanos and some of the national forests in Mexico and New Mexico, for example, right? Those were all used to be essentially ejivos for a lot of communities. And so a lot of that struggle is woven in there as well. And Earth Day, so the exact Earth Day is also the birth of Chicano Park. So this isn't, you can see this picture and it's on the same day as Earth Day. Here, the kids planting trees, but the connection here is more, it's in addition to not just the park, the green of the park, but the community sense of the park and the struggle of the park in terms of fighting the California Highway Patrol, which meant that they would have gotten a patrol station rather than a community park that they had been promised. In terms of outdoor experience as well, this is youth in the 1940s swimming in LA, and there's stories like this. In that case, is the Marrano Park, for example. Verano Beach was the place for a lot of familias to go to. And part of that history is woven in also the recreational aspects of our current lands. And then other familiar components that connect to environmental justice, what we might consider traditional environmental justice, Mothers of East LA, but also represented in parts throughout the whole country. So this is from 1993. By the journal in support from the Center for Race, Poverty and the Environment in 1993, and it's talking about the Latino experience in relation to environmental justice and injustice, and it talks about Puerto Rico, Texas, New York, California, Denver, like all of these lessons, right? That for me, I'm like, where have these been as I'm going through my education into 2000s? And so this is part of that struggle in history, some that are familiar names, Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. And what this is getting us to is how this reconnects to some of the ancestral knowledge that we want to acknowledge, that represents in modern consumerism as well. And that's part of why this is still funny, right? To say the butter container in the fridge doesn't have butter. It will have something other than butter, especially salsa and beans. But these are conservation behaviors, even as communities may not identify with the term. And so I'm going to close with this last session around then what is radical and revolutionary. And so for me, radical is based on the root of the word is root, right? So how do we return to our raíces? How do our raíces inform us? And being radical in that way rather than seeming as this extreme outlier. And what is revolutionary? That means un revolucionario, right? It's about the revolución. It's the cycles. So what are cycles that we can reconnect to as part of this healing with and for nature? Um, and there's examples of that, of how the Tenochtitlan, for example, was a zero waste society in many ways because they had a lot of regenerative and sustainable elements that we can identify today. But it just goes to show you how much relearning in many ways we need to unpack and do. The acequia system, of course, of the Southwest. Some of you are very familiar with that. There's been a rebirth and reconnection to understand water, not just as a resource, but how as a communal responsibility. And that these elements that we talk about in nature and the outdoors, um, they're they're connected in many ways to our communities. And so familiar maps of migration that often we can get excited around. In ecology, for example, the monarch butterflies, this is important. They are important pollinators. They're important to protect. And how does that translate into understanding also migration maps of people? And what does it mean for the farm worker migration experience to be able some things to connect to and to protect in the same ways and to care for because it's there, right? That symbol of the monarch butterfly is connected to migration in our communities in many different ways, with deeper roots through Dia de los Muertos and stewardship, even as within Mexico, of course, that ecological battle is also being fought. So that's part of the beautiful struggle and complexity. And so as we think about the outdoors here in the United States, is to acknowledge this full spectrum of people that will, that the intentional users like myself now, that I like hiking. I can hike and I can camp. I'm checking the time as well. And then hike and I can camp. And there's also people that for whom camping and hiking and backpacking might be new, but a connection to land isn't. And this allows us to look at the way in which we relate to and interact with nature to say it doesn't have to just be human object. It isn't just here's the tree and here's a thing that I can count and measure. There's also other elements, especially if you weave in indigenous components to say, what does it mean for them to be a member of the community? And so that can help us unpack as we look at underrepresentation in the outdoors to understand how we might be underrepresented, but even those that show up are present. So a lot of the data from a few years ago showing that as Latinos, we're underrepresented. However, those that show up tend to spend the most time compared to others, to consider themselves outdoorsy compared to others, and spend more money, right? So this is part of that nuance and what may seem like contradictory information to hold, pero it's a way we say estamos aquí, and that matters. And so this translates into how we hold solidarity with other communities because those relationships are also there to unpack that. So you can ask a question and say, hey, interest in hiking, and here's some here's some data from the 2017 Nature of American studies, and 19% here for Black demographic category, only 19% is for a lot. But if you flip the question to interest in walking outdoors, all of a sudden they all go up. So, you can ask the question, what's the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? That's what I mean about understanding cultural elements, unpacking them, and how we build relationships with others, because that's why the narrative and story matters, what we affirm as belonging and having value. And so, because that's what's affecting the Black community, acknowledging that there is an Afro-Latinidad, right? That matters. And so we need to hold space of that and responsibility and allyship for that. Close with this. And we see some elements of this still as well. Chicalote. So if I'm getting the information from a USDA, for example, right, here's what it can tell me. Here's all that information that is valuable and that is useful. So I want to make sure that this isn't being dismissive to our traditional naturalists, because I have that training as well. But then if I go hiking with my uncle, for example, then you get information like this. This is from a database in Nayarit. Puede usarse en diversos usos medicinales. Like, so you see the element of not just here's a thing and here's what you name it. It's here's what we call it, and here's the type of community use that it has. So to me, those are elements. So I'll close by sharing a bit of the Latino stories. Is to me is being able to see how people have been representing themselves through their cultural elements, even as they're outdoors, and how for me through art, it's been important for me to share that. This is some of my artwork as well. And that's why the founding of Latino Outdoors for me was critical, to be able to say, what are the ways in which we're showing up, we're building community, we're supporting each other, and then we're having impact on public policy. This was the memorandum under the previous administration. This was a resolution that we passed in California, the first of its kind, as far as we could tell, that recognizes Latino contributions to conservation. And of course, a lot of the recent outdoor equity grant funding that we've been doing just as in New Mexico. So with that, I'll close by saying it's important for me as I think about it, simplify, amplify, and connect. It's the story that we tell. And I know we're at time, so I'm going to close by reading this very, very quick poem. ¿Y tú quién eres? Soy los sueños y memorias de mis antepasados, sueños de momentos aún no llegado, memorias que cargan historias del campo, del monte, de un horizonte lleno de esperanza, la adivinanza de ¿qué eres si eres de aquí y de allá? Yo no soy menos, sino que más, porque mi cultura me guía como un compás. So with that, gracias.